So, welcome back to the show. We haven't had a guest on for a little while because of travel, but if you're sticking in to listen today to the Redacted Culture Cast, I have a feeling that we're going to be diving into not only a little bit of culture, but theology as well. And today's guest is not one who I've had the pleasure of meeting personally, but has been on my list of people I've been looking forward to have a talk with for a long time. So, Peter, will you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Appreciate coming on here, dude. So my name is Peter Ildefonsa, and I always throw in a caveat there. Ildefonsa is not my real last name. I stole that from my grandmother. It was her maiden name, and it means battle ready. And so when I was trying to come up with a name to use to be a little bit more interesting and have a little personal separation, and I discovered what her name meant, I was like, that is way too perfect for me not to use that. Um, so I am a filmmaker first and foremost. I've been a wedding filmmaker for about 6 or 7 years now, specializing in like luxury destination events. And when 2020 hit and COVID hit and lockdowns and all of those sorts of things, I wasn't able to, travel the world and film large gatherings of people anymore, obviously. So I started looking for what else I could do with filmmaking and how else I could apply that. And essentially, I had strong drawings to the military because of familial history, which is something we'll probably get into. And rather than pursuing that in a culture and political atmosphere that was just very tumultuous and I didn't want to go there, I decided, well, actually, after watching a bunch of Lucas Botkin's videos, I was just like really convinced of a belief that I already had that civilians being prepared is very not, I don't want to say equal, and offend people who have served in the military, but I do believe it is a very equal way that people can serve their country. I'm super grateful for the men and women, of course, who have actually served in the military, but civilians being prepared, according to our founding fathers, I believe was one of the ways that we actually serve our country by us taking responsibility of our own lives, of our own safety. We are doing our part, and something that Jordan Peterson, huge favorite of mine, talks about a lot is, clean your room first. Set your own house in order. Before you start worrying about these big social global issues, deal with your own life. When that's in order, now you can step outside of that. And so simply civilians being prepared, responsible, taking care of their own health, their safety, their families, that's one of the greatest things and contributions that they can make. And so I decided to take that concept and start to pursue a lot of the disciplines that I really wanted to pursue: shooting, physical fitness, things that I was already pursuing but wanted to take more seriously, overall preparedness, masculinity, just all of those concepts, and just using filmmaking to document that process. And I started doing that seriously probably about a year ago is when I leaned into Instagram a little bit more. And recently I've been diving into YouTube, and YouTube, I hope, will be more of my home because the longer form video is just so much better for accurately communicating things. So right now, I am essentially just, like I said, just a guy. I'm focusing in on masculinity, fitness, and guns and shooting and all of those sorts of things, and using filmmaking as a way to present it. Part of my mission is to make guns mainstream, not individually, but obviously take part in that process. And what I mean by that is not make guns themselves mainstream, but make owning a gun mainstream or normalize gun ownership. And I say that because the more people, again, the more people we can have stepping up and taking ownership of those responsibilities, I really do believe the fewer problems we'll have in society. And so I want to do that by creating the highest quality content that I possibly can and being a little bit of a different face in the gun space than what you normally see with your typical ex-military or redneck or camo flannel, orange wearing, dudes out there. So that's not really me. People are always super surprised when they find out that I like guns and that I carry guns. I've gotten shocked faces plenty of times when like, wait, you really? So I was like, well, hey, yeah, let me lean into that.
Yeah, the subject of stereotyping is always one
Oh
of
yeah.
those that gets people riled up, and they're and I remember sitting in a guy's living room in 2020, And it was in 2020, and this is of course this was almost right before the riots kicked off, and
Mm.
he was going on this long, passionate rant about how stereotyping is racist and it identifies certain people, and then in the same breath, he said that we need to find a way to get rid of the white Christian men because they're the problem. And you're like, I mean, and it sounds so hyperbolic, but it was
Yeah.
something. It was something that was just like, I realize that I'm not exactly having a conversation here. I'm listening to a very frustrated man rant about his issues, and he's going through his challenges and giving him in the sense of like extending grace. It's like, okay, I'm not viewing this as a logical argument. He's frustrated about these things. He's trying to understand. He's trying to work through it, but the contradiction is a little extreme because you're saying stereotyping is bad, but we should stereotype other people, and you're like, you're winning. That's We'll
Yeah.
polish the argument up before
Yeah.
you really figure it
For
out.
sure.
Um, so the second thing that you said though that I thought was that kind of fits into this time is I'm reading a book right now called The First Way of War, and it talks about the early method of fighting in America, particularly the frontiersmen,
Hmm.
and how what became the Rangers sort of came to be. And
Mm.
the author's premise is something like the combination of people fleeing the religious wars in Europe with the way that you had sort of a guerrilla-ish conflict on the
Hmm.
United States soil combined in a sense to produce the form of warfare that we refer to as ranging, which is something like patrolling plus combat, or no, patrolling, not necessarily patrolling in the way that people think about it in Iraq and Afghanistan, but patrolling in like the classic ranger school sense. But the more distinct element was irregular forces, so that they're not your uniformed marching,
Right.
listening to the officer, red coat style warfighter, which was very Napoleonic. But rather it's moving in the woods, stealth. What we think about when we think about Bravo, was it Bravo 6 going dark or whatever the Call of Duty phrase is?
Yeah.
So that, like a lot of that meant that skill set, but also the target set was unlimited, which meant women and children were acceptable targets to the early Rangers. And then it
Hmm.
was a commercial process. Being scalping was the way to finance it, which in American history would be an extremely controversial thing to say because our whether it's controversial is kind of not the point. It was this interesting read from trying to be a historian's documentation on how this method of warfare developed. Now, that being the case, it's a difficult book to read because it's so easy to try to get distracted in moral arguments while you're reading it and try instead of trying to understand what the
Hmm.
author's writing.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
one point stood out very, very distinctly, and he said that the Rangers, being an irregular force that were not necessarily employed by the crown in a traditional sense, but in a sort of on contract basis or on a loose basis, were expected at every layer and every step of the way to be a better, more capable individual than a regular. And
Hmm.
this was a constant frustration between the professional soldiers of the time because the regular forces were having a horrible time trying to fight the French and the Indians in the French and Indian War, but also in the types of conflicts that were native to the United States at that time. Of course, for now we're talking about Native Americans as well. The sort of marching in line regular forces that were the gentleman's war of the Englishmen were not very suited for battle. But in
Yeah.
addition to that, the ranging individual, the private citizen, was expected to be a more capable warfighter than the professionally trained soldier. And in
Yep.
our day and age, we keep coming back to the same topic about how, well, civilians should be allowed to have night vision. Should be allowed. It's this weird way of approaching the question as if it's
We're
like
coming at it from the incorrect direction. We're coming at it backwards.
we're coming at it from a historical perspective that isn't as traditional as we think it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
100%. And that's something with the talking about like changing the face of the gun culture or the face of the gun culture shifting radically in the last 10 20 years. That's something that's really fascinating because there's so much gatekeeping, is so much gatekeeping. And I've even had conversations with active military guys that were like, oh yeah, buy a gun, buy this, buy that. And then would in the next sentence be like, oh, but if you're like, you know, practicing raids and stuff like that and wearing like body armor and night vision as a civilian, you're retarded, was the word that was used.
Oh,
And
oh
I was like,
no.
well, why? And I couldn't get a logical explanation. And I was like, look, I understand that if you're saying you have a civilian over here who's like at best with their carry gun, and they're then strapping on body armor and night vision and going and practicing, you know, one man CQB. Yes, that's retarded. That is very, let me use a better term. That's a very stupid and foolish thing to put your time into. Get good at the weapon that you are most likely to use first. But why are we discouraging people from doing that? And why are we downplaying the role and gatekeeping civilians from engaging in all of these sorts of things? And if you look at it, even some of the biggest war heroes that the US has seen in World War II, World War I, Civil War, Revolutionary War, were all civilians who either volunteered or were drafted. And some of the most decorated soldiers in history, one of the most decorated soldiers in US history, Sergeant York, was a civilian who was drafted. Like, and the reason that he was so decorated was because the things that he did were absolutely unbelievable. And the things that he did were unbelievable because he was so good of a rifleman and so good of a marksman that within like a few weeks, I don't remember the numbers, but within a few weeks of being in the military, after having resisted going to the military for religious reasons, he then became one of the like instructors for marksmanship, because they were just like, this guy can handle a rifle better than anyone else we've ever seen. And so that gatekeeping and keeping civilians from that is just really strange to me. And so a little bit of context, what really kicked me into this idea too of focusing on engaging more of the civilian culture. And by more, I do very directly mean people outside of the gun space. It's very easy to get into the gun space and start preaching to the choir, but I would much rather be a missionary for gun ownership, if you will. I want to expand that as much as possible, get rid of the gatekeeping and expand that circle, and then raise the standards, the excellence within that circle, but still expand that. But one of the things that pushed me to that was I was listening to my grandfather, who was military in Cuba, and then when he escaped to the US, joined the army, and then he may have gone to special forces. That's what I remember being told, but I have not been able to confirm that. He definitely went into the CIA and then was running covert operations into Cuba and Nicaragua and a few other countries. And what he was doing, even after leaving the military, he with some friends would take a boat and just like get into Cuba, and they would train insurgents. They would train civilians in physical fitness, in weapon handling, in, you know, survival, woodland survival, and things like that, to just make them better skilled and more skilled. And so again, like that focus on the civilian culture. And I understand that that would be like a society who's actively seeking to rebel against their government. I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily what we have, but that's what the Second Amendment is for. We're supposed to be actively trained and prepared to push back against the government if necessary. And so that was a huge inspiration for me in kind of tying all of the back around. And I was like, oh, what if I went into the military again, sitting back in 2020 without a job because of COVID? And I was like, oh, what if I go into the military? I'd just gotten married, and I was like, that would be a little bit of a unfair thing. My wife was wonderful. She was like, I would support you if you decided to, but that definitely wasn't what I was expecting when we got married. And I'm like, that's a radically different life to suddenly say like, hey, by the way, that life of us being together most of the time at home, yeah, that's not going to happen anymore. I feel like that's very much something that if you are going to do, your spouse should know before you actually get married that you're going to be gone. And I really wanted to pursue like special operations if possible. So that would have obviously been even worse. So that's when I said, well, let me take the skill sets that I do have, let me take my attention and put it into something that I believe is still serving my country in my own way, helping citizens and civilians be capable. And the more I've gotten into it, the more that I've been like, man, any notion of not pursuing capability, military-like capability as a civilian, is really historically inaccurate. Like that's kind of what the government intended for us to be doing. That's what our founding fathers intended for us to be doing. And then I also believe that there's something of a historical and biblical model in that, not to get like too extreme, but when you look at an example that I draw to is when you look at Abraham, which whether you're a Christian or not, I think most historians and archaeologists agree in like a lot of the veracity of the Old Testament historical documentation. And this man named Abraham, you know, he's in a different country. He's obeying God and following God. And then some people come and attack him and they take some of his family away. And he gets his army together,
His
leads
personal
them.
army. Yep.
His personal army leads them, goes off, wipes all of these other governments, other countries, essentially other cities, defeats them without seemingly hesitation. It doesn't seem like there's a fear going on. And there's a lot of emotional conflict documented surrounding the person of Abraham. And I'm reading between the lines a little bit. I don't want to insert my opinion or my thoughts into the Bible, but there is, anytime Abraham came up against a situation that he was distraught or nervous or anxious or whatever, it's documented. And in this case, like there's nothing. He got his personal army together. He went, pursued, fought, won, brought them back. And so I do believe there's a little bit of that. And this is why, interrupting myself, this is why I oftentimes say like responsibility precedes right. We have a responsibility to protect and defend our life and way of life. And that's what precedes the right that the Second Amendment then gives us to do that. And I believe that responsibility goes even further back than just our founding fathers. I think it goes back to beginning of man.
Okay, so there's going to be a bunch to unpack there, and if we were just meeting each other, this would probably be a more acceptable way of saying it. But gatekeeping has always been a challenge for me. The subject of gatekeeping, because I haven't, I don't see it. I really don't see it the way, like, I've seen it happen in the past, but those are almost like caricature examples. The other problem, the other problem that I have though is like I have my credentials. You can't really gatekeep me out of it because I did the military thing, I did the special operations thing, right? And so if I were to use culturally relevant but sort of despicable language, I would say I'm privileged enough to not have to worry about that issue.
Yeah.
However, to be more specific about it, and I think to be more to produce, in the words of Maj Touré, more solutionary about it, the point that I want to start on the subject of not just gatekeeping, but how you've seen that attitude be approached and how you've moved away from it or how you've moved through it. Because for me, this idea of gatekeeping, like I know what it is. We've talked about it multiple times on the show. On a second note, unapologetically Christian here. It's a personal pet peeve when gun culture men say that men need to be strong, and I'm a Christian, but they approach this kind of Christianish language from almost like a don't punch me, bro. I'm gonna say I'm a Christian kind of attitude.
Yeah.
If all the greatest warriors I've ever met in this world were all men of faith, and that is a flat blank, no questions asked. And I'm not being biased. I'm saying the people who were the best at it, the most convicted, the most capable, all of them turned out to be good Christian men. The people who were these kind of neo-paganist or atheist, new atheist movement, those were the people who I encountered who were the most likely to be susceptible to PTSD because they didn't have any moral framework by which to understand the tragedy of war.
100%.
So if you
and the whole concept, I'm going to interrupt you and I won't run with it, but I'd love to come back to this. Christianity in the gun culture is a really fascinating thing to me because it's a culture and an industry that's basically like God, family, country. And you'll see so many people say God, family, country, but then their belief in God has like no actual established grounds.
Yeah. Well, it's like
I haven't thought through it a lot.
Let's see. To be kind about it, it's a difficult subject that you have to. It is a lifelong pursuit, for sure. But the other side of it is like, your spiritualism doesn't count. Sorry.
Yeah.
Like being vaguely spiritual about a sort of God being out there, you're committing to nothing. And that's a pretty harsh way of saying it. But we'll
it's interesting. Yeah, I'd love to talk about that more later, is all I wanted to say.
We have to get into our theology part, because I'm now starting to wonder, like, oh, is he Reformed? Is he Baptist? Is he a Presbyterian? Are you a papist? What is going on here? Are we gonna have an orthodoxy argument? I don't know what's going on. But more importantly, and back to where we were at on the subject. So gun culture, we've talked about it shifting quite a bit. And you made the statement, responsibility precedes rights. Can you explain that a little bit?
So some people would say that this is splitting hairs. Obviously, there's the concept that I would say is widely accepted, that with any right comes responsibility. To quote Peter Parker's uncle, with great power comes responsibility, or whatever it was that he said. And generally speaking, if you have the right to do something, and that right is enabling you to do something, then there's a measure of responsibility carried with that. I say it goes the other way around. In this case, when it comes to gun ownership, personal protection, etc., I say in that particular field, responsibility precedes right. Because when we talk about the Second Amendment in the US, we very often get stuck in the whole concept of gun ownership. And you're going to go, wait a second, but the Second Amendment is defending the right to keep and bear arms. So that is gun ownership. But I believe that if we say the Second Amendment is our right, and the entire thing of the Second Amendment is framed up in our right to keep and bear arms, and that's where our responsibility comes from, then the responsibility for me to keep and bear arms is rooted in a document that's only a couple hundred years old. That's because that right is preceding my responsibility. My right to carry a gun on me when I go out in public, my right to own weapons of war, whatever those are limited to, is all of those things are precede my responsibility to do that. So I do believe I have a responsibility to carry a gun when I go out in public. I do believe that I have a responsibility to be a prepared citizen, able to push back against a tyrannical government. I believe those are my responsibility. If right precedes responsibility, then that responsibility only goes back as far as the Second Amendment, if you're an American living in the US. And technically, then it only applies to American citizens, right?
Yep.
People under the Second Amendment. If I say, however, responsibility precedes right, then what I'm saying is that there was, I believe, created by God, a responsibility for everyone, particularly men, 100% particularly men, to protect their life and their way of life. And I always say life and way of life, because I believe you have to protect your own actual life, but then you also have to be able to protect the way that you believe God has commanded you to live your life. Or if you're not a Christian, the way that you believe you ought to order your life. And if someone pushes back against that and tries to say, no, you can't live your life the way that you're supposed to, you have to be able to protect that. That's physically, that's going to be verbally. You have to be able to stand up and give a verbal defense and argue for why you should be able to live that way. That's why I think being articulate is so important. So that, I believe, is a responsibility that everyone, particularly men, as I said, has had from day one of creation, since the beginning of time. That responsibility then applies before the Second Amendment was put in place, applies before guns even existed. You know, you go back before guns existed, and I would say, like, if you're a farmer who's raising your family in the way that you see fit and the way that you believe is right before God, and you have a bow and arrow and a sword, or, you know, whatever it was, and people come and attack, you have a responsibility. So it applies to that farmer. It applies to people in countries that are not legally allowed to access guns. They need to find a way to live that out. And I don't want to be as narrow-minded as keeping this just to America. By saying responsibility precedes right, I now say that the concept that the entire Second Amendment is based on, and my belief system regarding my responsibility as a citizen in America, extends outside of the US and outside of the American people since the founding of the nation, and extends to the entire world, to mankind throughout the entire world for all of history. To me, that's much more of that's a much bigger weight of responsibility than my responsibility as an American citizen. Now it's my responsibility as a human being and as a man.
So I, while you were talking, and I admittedly do not have the exact wording of the Second Amendment memorized anymore. It goes, but the phrase is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
Right.
And I want to think about, I want to go through a process of rereading that phrase with you, with your thesis in mind. That being, responsibility precedes right, because I think the issue that you see here, or no, and if you're just to go with a linguistic game, the statement says a regulated militia being necessary first, and then following the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And if you're familiar with like Twitter conversations and that sort of low level argument that regularly gets brought up against the gun culture about, it's about a well regulated militia,
meaning we need regulations for firearms.
Yeah, I don't find it a respectable argument, and I don't find the people making it respectable individuals either. And that sounds like an elitist. And if that's how you want to come at me, bro, then like so be it. But the the point that makes more sense coming from your argument of responsibility precedes right is maybe, just maybe, what the Second Amendment is saying is that it is not moral nor capable in reality for a person to export their individual responsibility to keep and bear arms. That you cannot place that burden of responsibility on somebody else, ultimately before God and the Constitution, not to be confused as the fourth, not to be confused with like the fourth person of the Trinity, but between God and the Constitution, you can't really ultimately at the end of the day, you cannot export that responsibility onto somebody else's shoulders
For sure.
without bearing the responsibility of doing so.
Yeah.
And
super well said.
Okay, because it's been a challenge too. I've been approaching the question of the Second Amendment from a maybe similar but different angle, and I want to hear your thoughts on it. Particularly, the Second Amendment is used in contemporary world views to talk about a right to self-defense. And the right to self-defense is framed or couched in a Darwinian perspective where your right to self-defense is the right to continue living so that you can continue on passing on your way of living or your genes or whatever. And it's almost like this pseudo combination of Darwinianism and utilitarianism, where the right to self-defense, the utility of it is that you don't die, and the ethic of it is survival of the fittest.
Right, which is such a interesting point for if you're a leftist and an evolutionist and a Darwinian evolutionist, you have a problem because your ideology basically enables us, and I'm now saying us, and I'm just going to qualify that, the gun culture, to assert our superiority of survivability. If the government were to end or the government were to try to take over, our survivability is going to be significantly higher. Why? Well, we've actually trained and prepared to survive. Most people in the left have not. And those who are, extremely against gun ownership, again, their survivability is going to be very, very low. So their ideology kind of caters to their own extinction. Our ideology would actually protect them a little bit more in that, no, we don't think that just because we're the fittest, we get to survive, or whatever.
Yeah,
from that,
you could get. I recognize that there's a way that this could get really dangerous, but when you looked at the riots of 2020, and I was living in Minneapolis at the time, the riots of 2020 to 2021, the kind of people that were perpetuating the violence and the looting in the Twin Cities were the kind of people that if they didn't have supermarkets would die of starvation.
Yeah.
And so they wouldn't. And I don't mean this in like a casual hunting way. I mean a combination of their intellectual capability, largely illiterate or challenges with literacy challenged, Um, culturally resentful, so low social skills, low
Yep.
interaction ability, right? They had their own communities. And none of this is going to sound kind, but I think I need to cut to the chase on this one. The kind of people who are looting and burning buildings were the kind of people that if there wasn't an infrastructure to replace the things that they destroyed, would literally die of starvation.
Yep.
They would just waste
100%.
away. And so,
Which, if you hold to a Darwinian ideology,
mhm.
that's nature progressing and evolution progressing.
Well, there are rooms for criticism, like how did the public education system fail them? What were they raised on? What was their family structure? What cultural influences drove them in that direction? And I think there's room for like a nuanced criticism. But if you're going to come from somewhat of an almost caricaturistic Darwinian sense, Darwinists aren't really the survival types of people. They tend to be the
Yep.
ones who don't have the worldview by which to survive on, unless it's some sort of short-term hedonism. And so it's interesting to see where
Yeah.
what we also saw in Minneapolis was you remember like hearing about the Rodney King riots down in LA and
Mm-hmm.
like the roof Koreans.
Yep.
We had our porch Vikings where like we had people looking out after their neighborhoods, armed and capable and to mixed levels of capability, of course, but they basically would find their local businesses or their neighbor's business or whatever and say, you're not looting this street. And so the looters went to Apple, Timberland, Uptown, and they went to the bougie parts of town and they burned it out and destroyed it. And so
Yep.
to this day, Uptown is a smoldering husk of what it used to be. Um, and yet, the people who defended certain territories then had to open up their doors so that the people who had spent their time looting and burning could buy groceries, or in
Yeah.
some cases just liquor. But woo. Um, and so it's kind of an odd
Yeah.
position that people bear, because if we're going to turn this even more into a caricature, you've got the responsible gun owners who are holding society together with their duct tape and spittle, and then you have all the people who are complaining about them over here in different categories, and it kind of starts to paint the picture of almost like self-martyrdom, which is a really
Yeah.
dangerous ideology for anybody to take on, because this format of self-martyrdom very oftentimes precedes mass, not even fascistic, but mass like destruction when
Yeah.
the so-called defenders are tired of defending or whatever.
100%. And you made the statement, I think, before we started recording. Oh, shoot, the thought's leaving me.
And it departs.
I'll have to come back to it. I had it while you were talking. I was like, no, I want to hear what he's saying, and then I got too caught up in what you were saying.
Ruined. Okay, so let's go back into what we were talking about here with rights and responsibilities. So you went to school for theology. So did I.
Mm-hmm.
Did you during your either in your studies at school or afterwards, did you ever dig into investigate the origins of these concepts of rights and how you thought about that?
I didn't know. I didn't outright study theology. Obviously, I got into that, but I was actually more studying pastoral ministry. So less focused on some of the finer points of theology, more focused on applicable theology to shepherding a church would be the idea. I actually haven't gotten into that. And when you made the statement, this was actually a comment that I wanted to make. You just said the right to self-defense. It is funny because this is where the rights and responsibilities starts to get a little bit hairy as well. I believe biblically that we have a responsibility to uphold justice. Uphold justice, which is actually upholding justice is actually part of a government's role to be the sort of justice. So I believe that, but I believe individuals are also supposed to walk justly and uphold justice within their capability. And that would also mean resisting injustice or resisting tyranny. It goes both ways. So it's like you positively affirm justice and then you negatively push back on injustice. And I think that is a responsibility that preceded then the Second Amendment, saying like, hey, civilians now have the responsibility to push back against a tyrannical government. And I think that is a little bit more rooted than even saying that I have a responsibility to self-defense. So when people say like, oh, I have the right to self-defense, when people talk about, like you were saying, the Second Amendment in the frame of I have the right to carry a gun to protect myself, it's like, well, that's a very shallow reading. Actually, that's not really an accurate reading at all of the Second Amendment. Obviously, I think that citizens do, and I think everyone does have the ability and the right to protect their own life. But I think more of what it is you have the responsibility to push back against injustice. Now, someone attacking you, they're seeking to commit an injustice to you. It's not just about this individual focused, let me protect my own life. It's very much, let me actually resist this injustice that's going on and let me protect the image of God as seen in me. And this is why, I've seen Christians go back and forth on the whole issue of execution and capital punishment. And it's like, well, how can you believe if you're, against killing? And I'm always like, whoa. There's two. Hebrew has very distinct words, just like we do in English, for murder and killing. They're two different things. And the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, as translated in the King James Version, is inaccurate. It's very much thou shalt not murder. Thou shalt not take an innocent life. That's 100% killing is absolutely not anti-biblical.
You know how the King James Version came to pass?
Yes.
Yeah, so it was
Tell the story. It's fascinating.
Yeah, well, so when I went to school for theology, I learned Greek. I learned Koine Greek, so I could read the New Testament in its original language. Now, the Old Testament being written in Hebrew was translated into Greek, which we got the Septuagint, and then the Greek Old Testament and New Testament, which was at that point in time early, the zeros, whatever. This is translation. That Greek translation, or that Greek New Testament original Old Testament Hebrew to Greek translation, was then translated later into Latin, which is what was called the Vulgate, and that's where we get the Catholic. And then that Latin was translated into English, into the King James Version. And so to get to thou shalt not kill from thou shalt not murder, you went from Hebrew to Greek to Latin to English. Yep. And so
that final translation from Latin to English was overseen, or at least brought about and commanded by a pretty radically immoral, unjust king whose motives probably weren't particularly committed to actually holding to the word of God.
Even if we were to be suspect of King James' original intent and overseeing of the translation from Latin into English, there is the New King James Version, which went back after the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered.
I think so.
And they made corrections, right? I'm pretty sure the New King James Version, from what I understand, has some of its, let's just say, legitimacy restored, because the original King James Version is very in question. But the point being said, though, is that this information that the person who's saying, I think I'll make a bet here, the person who uses the person who uses the language "thou shalt not kill" from the Old Testament is probably the same person who's going to criticize people who believe the Bible by saying it was corrupted by something like the Council of Nicaea. And you're like, okay, so you're getting your I know what you're saying. You're getting your history from the Da Vinci Code. It's a great book. You got to love it. Super historical, really changes being sarcastic.
Yeah.
But so the same person who's going to say, well, the Bible says thou shalt not kill is the same person who's going to say, well, it's just a bunch of human corruption anyway. And while that argument itself is probably categorized as an ad hominem, it still sticks. That be careful about who you're talking to, because if they're being a disingenuous actor, they're saying, well, I'm going to hold you to a standard that even I don't believe is legitimate. Well, there's an issue there.
But tying this back in, so all of that to say, and I love that, but all of that to say that to interpret the Bible as saying that killing is wrong, has a lot of problems. And this ties into the issue of violence in the Bible and understanding violence as a Christian, which is a topic we also want to hit on. But if you bring this back into a self, let's say, you believe that it's your right to be able to defend your life, there's a couple of categories to that. One, the person who's attacking you and threatening your life is seeking to do an injustice. So you're actually resisting against injustice, which is a responsibility to do, to stand for justice and resist injustice. You're also then protecting the image of God as seen in mankind. And this is why capital punishment was a thing in the Old Testament. God told them, gave them certain scenarios of when they were supposed to, certain sins that were committed, and when capital punishment was right. And it was to uphold the image of God that was created and instilled into mankind. And so I believe that's our responsibility to uphold that, and it's our responsibility to stop the injustice. And so even the right to self-defense, if you frame it that way, ties back further into a responsibility that we have. And I think that's something, is that going to radically change your mindset when you go out into public carrying again? Maybe not. But I think understanding those nuances is important, and understanding, where a lot of these ideas come from.
Yeah, well, I think I even entered into the gun culture out of a concern for self-defense to some
For
extent. I
sure.
mean, I
For
also
sure.
entered in through a heritage, my father and my grandfather. But I don't think that's where it's not only the fact, I mean, wow, this is going to sound like a stupid live laugh love poster, but it's not only where you start, but where you end and how you get there. And you're like, "Oh my gosh, just give me a pumpkin spice latte and tell him to shut up." But I think more
Any
importantly,
sugar-free pumpkin spice latte, please.
does it have to be sugar free?
Almond with almond milk.
With almond milk? Oh, geez. I'm feeling my testosterone dropping drastically. Just hearing about it. Oh, Lord, heavens me. Sarcasm applied. So you keep saying this phrase, resisting injustice, and the thing that keeps communicating to me is that it depersonalizes the action. It doesn't dehumanize the perpetrator. It
Mhm.
says that what I'm doing is not about me. It's not that I'm offended. I'm not defending my kingdom. I am doing the right thing because I am resisting something that is seeking to do genuine evil. And
Exactly.
so and I think that's a really healthy place to be, but does require I think it's one of those concepts that requires a little bit of genuine introspection and sort of work to get there.
Well, I would say, and not to get super into just Christian doctrines and stuff like that, but Jesus says to pick up your cross, deny yourself, and follow him.
Mhm.
Being able to deny yourself, and this is also something Jordan Peterson talks about a lot, being able to deny yourself when we are very self-focused people naturally is something that is only truly possible as a Christian, as a believer filled with the Holy Spirit, regenerated, all of those sorts of things. So I would say you can't truly have that perspective apart from God helping you to understand that and have that perspective. Having said that, that's not to say that an individual who is not a believer can't recognize that something's not about them and it's about a greater purpose, if you will.
Yeah,
Here.
well let's not be so foolish to think that the illusion of self-sacrifice is always a it's always a clear example of self-sacrifice, because I mean this issue of I'm not doing it for me, I'm thinking back to 2020 riots areas, people were fighting against injustice
Sure.
by perpetrating injustice.
Yeah.
It's literally the Ibram X. Kendi book, which is
Yep.
um, racism is bad, give me money. There you go.
Yeah.
There's your thesis, and you're like, you know, this is not a solution. This is actually grifting, not good. There's a very holy martyrdom aspect of it
Yeah.
that you can see in this sort of denying injustice that is as a dangerous road to walk. But we're
But
also
even if you pull, to bring it back, even if you pull what the specific motives are, because you could say someone who is self-sacrificing, um, maybe they are doing it with a little bit of self-interest. Maybe they just are dying to be known as a hero. Maybe they hate their life. They're looking for an escape. I don't know what it is. There's a lot of reasons that could go into that. There's a lot of self-serving reasons, but let's pull motive out of that and just focus on the act itself, because that's the only thing that we can really control. That concept of this isn't about me. This is about something that's much more than me is really, really helpful. One, by I like the way that you said it. You're depersonalizing it, but not dehumanizing it. And I think that's the exact way to say it. But that's so important because that's where we pull back from the whole concept of vigilantism. I'm not now just simply going and seeking my own justice. I am being part of a society that upholds justice. And for me, this was also an interesting shift that I thought through when I got married and then recently had a baby. Because when I was single, I was much more reserved about what circumstances I would use a gun in. Because I was like, well, if it's my life and someone else's, I'm not 100% sure that I would actually defend my life just against someone. I would take someone else's life to protect mine. I wasn't sure about that. As a married man, that's a very easy call, because now if I let someone else kill me, I'm leaving my wife alone and neglecting my responsibility towards her. As a father now, that's, infinitely higher stakes of like, no, you 100%, I'll kill you if you threaten my life, because I am not going to leave my family without me. I should temper that. I will take your life if I have to defend my own life, because I have a responsibility to my family. I'm not looking to kill anyone. But as a single man, that was kind of a bit of a struggle for me. But when I started thinking about it in this context, it's a little bit less of a struggle, because it's not just about protecting your own life. It's actually about upholding a standard and enforcing that standard of justice, and of, no, human life is sacred, and you're not someone who can come over and take mine just because you feel like it. I can be as forgiving and merciful as I want, be like, well, I'm not going to kill you to do that. But that's not really my call. Even it's not really my call to say, oh, I'm going to give my life to just like give you a pass necessarily. I feel like it's more of my responsibility to actually resist that injustice. And it's 100% not personal. It's about actually having a society that observes and upholds justice.
Yeah, there's it's a let's try to dig into the ethics of this decision. The challenge that I brought up earlier, that we were talking about, kind of going back and forth about these rights responsibilities conversation, is that we very oftentimes approach it, as I was saying earlier, from like a utilitarian perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what you're getting at is, and it's not, I wish it was just an easy avenue of approach, but there's something deeper and something more moral and something more of an imperative which drives people into gun culture. Like, I want you, if you could, for me, go back again and give me the bullet points on how you got into gun culture. Like, how did you get into this world? Because you said you made a transition there. You told a story of, like, before, when I was single, I was a little bit undecided about these kind of scenarios, and I wrestled with it for a while. But as soon as you got married, and then even more so when you had a kid, when you had a child, that the ambiguity of that question went away. It was like,
Mm-hmm.
no, I will defend my life. I'm not really concerned about that.
Yeah.
Turns out responsibility is good for a man. So, how did you enter into gun culture, and what was it that motivated you? Was it fear for your life? Was it self-defense, or was it something else?
For me, it was interesting. So it was definitely not like an instant switch or anything. It was very much just my whole life. So I am a first generation. This is kind of going back to my story a little bit that I should have given at the beginning. So I'm a first generation American. I was born in America. Both of my parents were born in Cuba under Castro, and one of the greatest communist leaders ever. And I say greatest in a very real sense, but also in a very bad sense. That's a bad thing, obviously. And but brilliant man, brilliant leader, as was Hitler and all of the other most evil men and notorious men that have ever lived. Castro truly is in that category to an extent. So my grandparents fled the country and came to the U.S. to provide their families with a a fresh start, the ability to actually raise their families free. My grandfather on my dad's side was in the Navy in Cuba and actually stole a boat from the military. He was a lighthouse keeper on the not the northernmost point of Cuba, but the point of Cuba that was closest to the U.S. And he was a lighthouse keeper there, and he stole the military boat that he had been given and brought some friends and family over to the States, which is obviously an act of treason. So he was very much desired to be dead by the Cuban government for some time. With that upbringing, I completely grew up, even though I don't speak Spanish and I wasn't raised in South Florida and I wasn't raised around that as much. And a lot of people can't even tell that I'm not American because I am American. I was 100% raised in those beliefs of freedom and liberty and understanding why we came to America. People who have lived in America their entire lives and their ancestors have been in America oftentimes don't understand how significant the freedoms that we have are. I was raised, and this is a very common immigrant mentality, that's like, hey, you have the opportunity to get a job, you work your ass off because you don't know what we sacrifice to give you that opportunity for a job. I don't care how menial it is, I don't care how much you have to work, it's an opportunity, take it and work as hard as you possibly can. If something bad happens to you, it doesn't matter. It's the level of gratefulness for every single tiny little thing that we get to do in America is just exponentially higher than I've seen a lot of Americans who have American heritage. So that very easily leads into the whole concept of we have personal responsibilities and we have rights. And so all of those rights and responsibilities of America and American culture were like my family, my grandparents 100% on board with that. They registered and they became citizens. My grandparents became citizens and registered to vote the second they could because they were like, we're here, we are participating. We had no control in Cuba. We were under dictatorship. Well, we're not under a dictatorship anymore. So every single possible liberty that we have, we're going to exercise it. So that's how I was raised. Obviously, guns are a liberty that we have in America, and so exercising that makes sense. My grandfather then, I would go shooting with him since I was probably like 8, 9, or 10. I can't remember, but it was always just like 22 rifle, shooting at cans kind of thing. My family, my specific family, not my extended family, moved from Florida to Virginia when I was 6 years old, and so we kind of had a little bit of a farm. So then my dad got a gun to like shoot animals and stuff. And that then transitioned into, I don't remember the process, but at like 14, I got a 22 handgun. And then my dad got a like 9mm pistol for home defense. And just that progression just continued to build up. And when I was around 18, I would say, we met, my family met an elderly couple who the man was retired military, had been in the Air Force for like 30 years. And he was just like a radical proponent for concealed carry. And it was the first like legitimate exposure to concealed carry that I had. And so he basically within a year of knowing him, got my family out to a training class where we all trained. And so I purchased or I think my dad might have purchased it for me, a handgun that I could carry. In my mind is actually this side, this Kimber sitting right over here, that I still have just because it was my first legitimate weapon, even though I never shoot it anymore because it's kind of worthless. And I don't have any 45 ammo, I don't think. It's too expensive. But that was kind of my introduction into concealed carry. And I didn't really understand it too much beyond personal defense at that point. I was 20 when all of this happened. So the second I turned 21, I got my permit. But again, it wasn't out of fear. I mean, I live in the same area that I was at that age. And I live in a super, super safe area. But it was just very much that belief of, oh, if you have guns, your side, your society, your town, your city, your community is going to be safer. So if everyone has guns, we're going to be a safer place. Mm-hmm. And, I would regularly, we kind of lived around a bunch of farmland, and you'd see farmers, driving their pickup trucks with their rifles hanging in the back, very like traditional kind of culture in that sense. Men would drive up on a tractor to our house and he would have like a Colt 45 strapped to his leg in like a Western style holster, that sort of thing was very normal. You see people open carrying around town all over the place. And that just gave this sense of safety. So it wasn't out of fear that I was like, oh, you know what? I feel the need to protect my life. It was more out of understanding I'm supposed to be able to protect my life. So it's actually recognizing that that's a responsibility and something that I should be doing. I then, so that was when I was 21. I then graduated from college. My life went through a rough few years, and my concealed carry permit expired. I stopped carrying, and at that point, I only had like 2 guns, maybe like a hunting rifle, and then my carry gun. And I didn't shoot for years, and I didn't do anything that for years. And then again, when 2020 hit, I had just gotten married at the beginning of 2020. And the country just started kind of going crazy. And then I was out of a job and trying to figure out what I should do. That's then when I kind of defaulted again to my mind going, oh, well, you should go to the military. And then I also talked to my wife, who, sidebar, used to be radically anti-gun. And I'll never forget, we went on a backpacking trip one day, and it was pouring rain. It was pitch black. We could not see anything. Our tent didn't work, so we actually had to sleep outside using the tent as like a lean-to. And every time something, like any noise that she heard, she'd be like, you have your gun on you, right? I'm like, of course. I'm not going to go backpacking without a gun. She's like, okay, good. I was like, I thought you didn't like guns. She's like, I don't, but I feel a lot safer knowing you have one. So,
Oh, the stories.
oh yeah, I love those. So anyway, so at that point, 2020, I was like, hey, I really need to get an AR-15. And she's like, I agree with you. Our town's pretty small and conservative. There weren't like a lot of riots going on, but there was a riot that went right past our house at one point, and they smashed a few buildings. It was very small, very contained. No one got hurt, fortunately. No one got hurt, mostly because a local militia actually stepped into place and guarded a bunch of the main buildings that were being targeted. And the law enforcement came and worked together, which was a wonderful example of a local militia combining with a law enforcement to provide extra personnel that the law enforcement didn't have. So when I got an AR is when I then started to dig into this idea, like I said at the beginning, of how can I use filmmaking and apply it to this belief system. And basically what happened is I just started to dig into a lot of those beliefs that I had been raised in. And when I started to dig into those beliefs, combined with just being older, being more mature, being married, and being out of a job, which didn't necessarily contribute. I think that was just the opportunity that contributed. That's when I was like, I want to 100% get into this space. So the beliefs, the way that I've phrased it before, is the beliefs that I had been raised in: ownership, personal responsibility, liberty. Those were things that I knew to be true, but things that I had never had the opportunity or necessity to directly act on. As I said, I carried a gun for personal defense, but I had never felt threatened. So I was like, oh yeah, I should do this. And I want to do this, and it's cool to do this. And I believe that I should do this, but it was not very deep. When I stopped and had the opportunity to stop, and I think everyone, not everyone, but I think a lot of people in 2020, just with so many different things being shut down, had a little bit of a chance to breathe. And my entire life, I had been go, 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 go. I had never stopped, had never taken a break. I started high school when I was 11 or 12. I finished high school when I was 15. I went straight into college, and then I was pursuing music, and then I was doing actually seminary and music at the same time. So I was on track to finish with my master's by like 23. And then I had an injury that I couldn't do that. And then I went into, the filmmaking and wedding business, and I literally just never stopped. It was go, 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 go. And 2020 kind of put the brakes on, and it was wonderful. Right after getting married, put the brakes on. I was like, I can breathe, I can catch up, I can not be burnt out for probably the first time in my adult life. And then I sat and started to really just think through a lot of those beliefs that I had had casually. And I started to realize how much those were like core convictions of mine. I started to see how they were core convictions scripturally, that was a longer journey. But then I also just realized that, oh, this isn't just something that I think you should do because it's good. This is something that I 100% think is a principle that every single person on the planet should hold to.
Should with
That's
moral conviction, like ought. It's not just you could do. It's not like, oh, it's good for you. There's distinctions within moral convictions that, let's just
for
say,
sure.
where it's bad to do. It's prohibited. It's good but not necessary, and then it's necessary good. Like
Yeah.
it's good to do this, but
So
it's not.
I would have believed that it was necessary beforehand, just not super strongly, and I had never really stopped to think about it a ton. So I'll use fitness as an example. I believed that working out was a great thing to do, um, and even a necessity to some extent to be fit and healthy, especially as a man. Not to the extent that now, what will oftentimes get me out of bed in the morning when I absolutely do not want to go for a run, because I don't like running and I've been recently forcing myself to do it. What will make me get out of bed a lot of times is I'll literally be laying, okay, bed's warm, it's cozy, next to my wife, outside's cold, it's rainy, and I'm going to be, in pain for the next 45 minutes to an hour. Which one should I choose? And what drives me to get out of bed is I need to develop a tougher mind and I need to be a more fit man for my family. So that's a conviction that actually drives me to action, as opposed to it used to just be something that, oh, yeah, I believe that, but I don't believe it quite enough to drive me to action. That would be the difference when gun ownership really shifted into high gear for me. And that drove me to get into the gun culture. And I would say that's refined and strengthened over time in the last 2 years since I first posted my first photo on Instagram. Um, that has definitely continued to increase. The man that I referenced earlier who kind of got my family into the whole concealed carry thing, he would tell me, if you say that you believe something, but don't act on it, either you don't actually believe it or you're a fool.
Calvin talked about the same thing: knowledge not acted on is knowledge not known.
Yeah. And he was probably pulling off of Calvin, to be honest. So he then applied it to the Second Amendment and said, if you believe in, and I've said this before on my account, if you believe in the Second Amendment, but don't actually act on the Second Amendment in any way, either you don't actually fully believe in it, which I would agree with, or you're foolish enough to not act on it to whatever reason. And that can be harsh, and that's going to step on a lot of toes, because I do know a lot of people who would fall into that category. But I would just challenge that: do you actually believe it? And this comes back to that whole responsibility precedes right, because I believe that the Second Amendment comes out of a responsibility for all mankind. And if you don't actually believe that, then perhaps, and you're not actually acting on that responsibility, then are you being intentionally negligent? Would you prefer to be called intentionally negligent? And I'm not saying that to be mean and harsh to people, but I want people to stop and think, if you actually believe that, if you actually think that that's a good thing and that's a beneficial thing, and that you have the ability in the US to do that, then why aren't you? And if you aren't, then do you actually believe it?
I think this is something that you're going to bring very well to the gun culture, because just the way that you've been talking about it, the way that you've approaching this, I look forward to seeing your success with great anticipation, because you've put to words something that I've been struggling with, and that is the criticisms that gun culture people level at one another is very rarely anything to do with the material. Rather, it's, I
Yeah.
don't really believe you're genuine, right? Like you
Yeah.
would, and I think this is, there are different cases of it, but I think you're onto something here that's solid gold, and that is my, and I think maybe, and I'm just trying to put this to words as I'm speaking, but when I listen to, I sit in an ivory tower. We talked about this earlier when I said it, and I'm kind of coming to terms with this, but I oftentimes sit in a little bit of an ivory tower, maybe sometimes a glass house, where I've got the military background, I've got the special operations background, I have the reputation, whatever. It doesn't matter, right? Like I I'm not really worried about gatekeeping in the same way that somebody like Lucas Botkin might be concerned about gatekeeping, because I've kind of done the thing. No, I have my own frame. I have my own issues. Like, oh well, the guy's a Navy SEAL and he doesn't like Rangers or whatever. It doesn't matter. The point being said is, because And even then, for those who are listening and rolling their eyes and going, this douchebag. Yes, I still remember that how it worked in Ranger Battalion is you've never arrived. You are always working. But I admit that I don't have the same background that somebody even in your position might have to deal with. But so what I get to see is I get to see all these little arguments going on the internet and different gun culture arguments. This guy's getting yelled at by this guy, and this guy's being called out by this guy, and this is a stolen valor thing, and all these little drama things. And now for a while when I was working in publication, people wanted to come to me with their drama, just naturally the case. And one of the things that I think goes missing is that one person will accuse somebody of doing something or not doing something, and that accusation will be framed in sort of a utilitarian practical argument. But what they're really saying is, you say this, but you do that. Your words are not consistent with your actions.
Yeah.
You say that you're concerned about the self-defense of your family, and you're talking about community building, but your publicly stated advertisement for your loot box is, we're going to go build a bunker in the wilderness and we're not going to let you be a part of it. Or you see this sort of militia-esque attitude of like, we're for the community and culture building, but then the criticism that's leveled at you is, you're not really for the community, you're calling yourself a warlord or something like that.
Yeah.
Not ironically either. I mean, dude, come on, sometimes things are funny. But but I think that's one of the things, the criticisms that you've identified, that I think I would like to hear you expand on.
What criticism specifically?
So the criticism that this guy was saying about, if you say that you believe one thing, but obviously not enough, you don't believe it enough to really act on it. Like, you say you're concerned about the self-defense of your family, but you're not. Here's a hyperbole caricature argument. So you're a concealed carry guy with a handgun, and you're like, oh well, you believe in the responsibility to defend your family, and I come to you and go, oh well, do you train with your handgun? And you go, yes. Good, right?
Yeah.
Because your actions are consistent. Your actions are consistent with your claimed value. But then I come to you and say, yeah, but do you have a plate carrier? And then you go, no. Oh, now what is the criticism? That you don't have a plate carrier, or that having a plate carrier is somehow necessary for you to be fulfilling that responsibility of being the defender of your family in some cases.
And so now that gets into actually defining a line of what level of preparation, if you will, or what level of action is necessary for a belief in the Second Amendment, or belief in anything. So if we take that whole concept that I was talking about and say, doctor comes to someone and says, hey, you're extremely overweight, your health is at risk, you could die a lot younger, you could have a heart attack, whatever it is, you need to make habits changes, lifestyle changes, and you need to get healthy. And the person is like, oh my gosh, yeah, 100%. And then I talk to them and they make no changes and they continue to eat extremely like the average American diet, and they continue to live a very unhealthy lifestyle. They're not active at all. And be like, oh, but what did the doctor say? Well, the doctor said like I need to make changes, or I could die sooner. Let's say we're talking about someone who's in their 30s. They have some concept of, if you're in your 30s, I'd imagine most people have a realization of their mortality at that point. Maybe you don't in your 20s, but in your 30s, you start to feel things a lot more. But you're also young enough that you're not like thinking about dying anytime soon. But then I say, okay, well, the doctor said that you need to make some changes. You're making those changes. It's like, nah, I just haven't gotten around to it. Well, you think he's right? Yeah, of course I think he's right. Duh, I think he's right. Like, obviously, like, I think he's right. Well, do you actually believe that your life will be potentially shortened? I would argue, and I would stand by this. And this is an example that would apply to tons of people who live unhealthy lifestyles and do actually think that their life would be better, and their risk of death at a younger age would be smaller, and the risk of disease in general would be smaller if they simply ate better and were more active and lived a healthier lifestyle. That they believe themselves to be the exception. They don't believe that something bad would actually happen to them. They are believing the lie in the moment of choosing not to exercise and choosing to eat something that's really bad for them. They're believing that that short-term pleasure is worth the risk of potentially, you know, having negative consequences down the road. There's whatever their belief system is, whatever it is that they're choosing, whatever lie they're choosing to embrace, they don't actually believe that they are at risk of all of the health consequences that come with being significantly obese. So that's an example of someone who, like, they say that they believe it, they acknowledge it, they can spell it out, but if they actually believed it, then there's no way that they wouldn't act on it. So their very inaction is proof that they don't actually believe it and that they're delusional in their own head or buying into some lies in their own head. And that's a little bit clearer to see that it's like, if it was very specific and the person was like, the doctor told them, like, hey, you're at severe risk of a heart attack. Like, you don't have a good heart. You have a history of heart attacks in your family. There's this and there's that, and you drink way too much, and whatever, all of the factors that contribute to this person could be at significantly higher risk. And they say that they believe that because obviously they're not going to say the doctor's an idiot, but then they still do nothing. There's tons of people that hear that type of news and then still make no changes whatsoever. And I would say that's not belief. I don't know 100% what that is. I think there's a level of delusionality. What's the word there? I'm not sure. They're definitely disillusioned to some extent, but that's not belief. Belief, legitimate belief, is going to lead to action in some capacity. What that action would be to say that, okay, you now are a believer in the Second Amendment is it, okay, you have to own an AR-15, you have to have a plate carrier, you have to have night vision. I don't know where that line is, but I do know it at the very least would have to include owning a gun of some kind.
Yeah, so I think thank you for sharing that. Thank you for bringing that up in that way. As you were talking about it, yeah, the line is in question. What is it that, I mean, there isn't really, the fringe of gun control is a bit of a watercolor. There are certain things that leave you inside or outside for sure, but it's not a very clear distinction outside of specific factors. So there isn't an aesthetic, there isn't a specific tribe, there isn't a certain background that's necessary, and I think you're good there. But I want to go back to this idea. So in philosophy, so the rest of my education is in philosophy, theology, history, and Greek. We have to make distinctions. Which, if you're, I think I remember a professor telling me, if you don't know what to write about a distinction, because at least you have something somewhere to start. And it's like he was saying in a bit of a tongue-in-cheek fashion, where you see a lot of like distinctions being made in philosophy because, well, there's a lot of differentiation, A from B, X from Y, this from that. But what you're talking about here, I want to break down this. It's not a premise, it's a combination of premises, which is, if a person may acknowledge that they have a worldview, or they may acknowledge that a certain worldview is true, as in it has correlation to reality, but they either don't believe it, as in they don't act like they believe it. So this is a faith question that you say that you say X, but your actions dictate Y. You say that we are sinners saved by grace, but you are trying so hard for works-based redemption, or something like that. Or you're even not trying. Like you say faith without works is dead, but you don't really act on it. You just pontificate and become angry. So to solidify this, there is, in distinction, there is the premise: a person holds X to be true, or has a worldview that you have a responsibility to bear arms. That is a premise. I can think that the world is such that me, being a man, bears a responsibility to bear arms.
And I'm going to interrupt really quickly. I don't want to derail you, but I will forget this. And that is where I think the distinction of responsibility over right is important, because I think a lot of people think they have the right to, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have the responsibility to.
Yes, I think we're going to get to there through this argumentation,
Okay, sorry, keep
because
going.
no, no, you're right though, because you're correct in the sense that
You don't have to be so upset about it.
I'm so angry. This is just my Swedish cheeks turning, my Midwestern. Hey, don't you know? Hey, sorry there. So let's get moving on. But you have the premise that a person holds the proposition, um, a person, by being a person, I have the responsibility to bear arms, to be true. Their actions, however, do not follow through with that, as in they do not bear arms. Either their premise is misguided or their action is in betrayal of the premise. Either so, one of those two things
Yeah,
is this is making it more complicated than it isn't. It is not more complicated than it needs to be. Is just as specific as we have to be.
yeah,
So you have the hypocrite, the betrayal of the premise and the belief. You have the liar who claims to believe something but doesn't actually believe it. Or you have this difficulty, and I think you could also call it a bit of a crisis of faith, where I know it to be true, but I don't really believe it because my heart is not in it. My will is not there. And that is a third component, which is difficult because it includes words like cowardice,
yeah,
laziness, morality. You don't have you have the intelligence but not the moral fiber to follow through with what you ought to be doing.
yeah.
And I bring that up because buried in most arguments that I see launched at, or criticisms that I see launched at people back and forth within gun culture, the the center of the sabot, the delivery mechanism is the utility, but the weapon, the center of the sabot round, you know what a sabot round is, right?
Mhm.
The center of the sabot, the piercing dart at the center is you're not living up to the moral standard that you're setting. And that is, at first, might cause people to reel and go, ooh, we're calling each other bad people. But that is quite literally, when done correctly, iron sharpening iron. It is quite literally going, and it is quite literally saying you're believing in a higher purpose, but you're not living up to it. I think you should do this. And then if people, as we expand on our openness and capability to dialogue on that level, I think that's something that
And
is.
I 100%, and I wouldn't even, I don't like to approach that type of conversation with people who I would put into that category. So if I have someone who claims that they believe in the Second Amendment, but doesn't own any guns at all, or maybe they just own, like, a handgun, or and think that the concept of an AR-15 is kind of ridiculous. Tons of people out there. That's a huge group of people. Um, I'm not necessarily going to sit down with them and be like, "Hey, you don't actually believe the thing that you say you do." I might, if it's like a really close friend or family member, someone that I can actually talk that way to. I think it's important for us to distinguish, because we're not able to accurately address that person and try to help them into the next stage of gun ownership responsibility. I'll say it that way, unless we understand what's actually going on with them. So if we're just like, oh, they say they believe it, they're just not there yet, we're now resigning our ability to actually interact with them. If we sit down and we have this conversation that you and I are having right now, and we come to an understanding, like, you know what, there's something else going on there. Either they don't actually believe it, maybe they do believe it, but they're a little bit, cowardly. They're too afraid, or they don't want to be, maybe they don't want to be viewed a certain way by people who know them. Maybe they don't want to be viewed as radical. That's potentially a huge issue, right? Um,
Mhm.
Maybe they just, whatever it is, there's a bunch of different things that could be going on there, whether hypocrite, liar, or cowardice, or whatever it is. By us understanding that if they did actually believe it, then we can help them. They think they believe it. We can then potentially help them come to an actionable belief. I wouldn't necessarily, again, sit down with that person and be like, hey, let me challenge your belief. There are some people that you could do that with, but I think in most circumstances, it's not going to be helpful.
But what you're doing there is you're talking about rhetoric, not logic. You're
Yeah.
talking about, like, yeah, sure. I don't go to my friend and just throw arrows at him without without the long standing relationship, beforehand. And that's where the whole "I'm just holding people accountable" thing on the internet doesn't fly. Like, you are an anonymous troll. You cannot hold people accountable. Those two
Yeah.
things happen at this is real. Like, if your contribution to gun culture is an anonymous troll, it is literally not possible for you to hold people accountable. All you're doing is criticizing.
And this is
So,
why I've attacked private accounts on Instagram, leaving strong comments,
is
which
that what you
actually
do?
annoyed. No, not that's not what I do. But I've one time I posted a story and saying attacking that whole premise of having a private account on Instagram and then leaving very, very strongly opinionated comments on people's posts. And
Yeah.
a few of
Have
my
you ever
followers
been?
got mad at me for
Uh,
that.
have you ever been to a bar,
Yes.
like an aggressive bar, where you have the
No.
bar fight guy who's yelling and throwing and getting ready to start a fight? Yeah, everybody knows who he is.
Yeah.
Nobody cares. Congratulations, you're the bar fight. The anonymous troll on the internet is the same thing. Like, not if you want to call this gatekeeping, you're not a serious player.
Yeah.
Now, trolling. Now, there's different levels of criticism. And so, if this sounds like walking it back, some people use anonymity to protect themselves in different ways, but there's also, like, the distinct combination of I make myself anonymous and then I make wild and aggressive accusations without developing any sort of legitimacy or relationship with people.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I guess that's what I'm
Yeah.
criticizing. Just
I was looking
because
for a quote along these lines. There's a line from, have you seen Knives Out?
I have seen.
Glass
Yes.
Onion, the second one.
Ooh, yes, I have. Unfortunately,
Um,
the rough movie.
I really liked it, so we won't go into it. But anyway, he had a line. Someone said something. One of the women in it said something, and she was just like, "Oh, I'm just speaking the truth or whatever." It's just like she was very careless. And the main character, Daniel Craig, said, "It's a dangerous thing to mistake speaking without thought for speaking the truth."
Yes, 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 yes. That's a
And
good line.
and I thought that was an excellent line.
Yeah, careless. There's a. I was scanning through Proverbs while we were talking on this last section, because I think there's this concept that we're talking about, that you brought up, is this idea of, like, I hold a worldview that a person bears the responsibility to bear arms, but they do not live up to that responsibility that they're claiming. And I don't mean that they're striving but failing. I mean they're refusing to try. Um, I think there's I know there's some passages in Proverbs that address this, but the word that you're talking, the criticism, loose criticism of talking without thinking, is not just, speaking your mind
Yeah,
or whatever. It's not
yeah,
speaking truth to power. Screaming into a bullhorn doesn't mean you're speaking truth to power. In fact, you might be the power that needs to be spoken to.
yeah, absolutely. But
Cheers.
yeah, I think it's. I have coffee over here, but I think it's something that I just think it's something that's helpful to think through, and I think how the how we communicate our beliefs is extremely important. And I think the motive behind why we communicate our beliefs, and this is a problem that I have with a lot of the gun culture, is um, man, I got into a short discussion, but a discussion nonetheless in comments, which I always avoid, but sometimes I'm like, I can't. And in this case, it was actually on one of my posts, so I felt responsible. And essentially, the person was just being very cut and dry, like, oh, you don't think that, there's no hope for you, whatever, that's stupid, I'm not going to engage in that. And I wish I could remember what the context was. It would make it a lot clearer. But I went back and forth a few times and essentially was like, okay, maybe, but perhaps it's worth actually putting a little bit of effort into understanding this person. So essentially, the scenario was someone commented on my post someone else engaged that person, basically just radically shutting them down, almost calling them stupid. And I would then was like, how is this actually helping that person? Is your motive to try to lead this person to your understanding that you clearly think your point of understanding is better? Or is your motive to simply walk over all of this person and assert your superiority? And I think too often I see people within the gun culture doing that. Not a ton, but I have seen it quite a lot. I've seen gun salesmen at gun stores do this. It's just like, well, if you don't know, then I can't help you. Be like, no. If the person doesn't know, it's your job to help them.
Yeah, if you work at a
If
gun,
someone knows and you
yeah.
don't, so if someone doesn't know and you know, whatever the context is, then help them know. That's why I hate that whole concept of, if you know, you know. People posting if you know, you know. I hate that. Be like, well, no, if you know and someone doesn't know, then teach them so that they now are in the know as well. Like the more people that know, if you think what you know is good, the more people that know and agree with you, the better. It's not about trying to push the person down who doesn't agree with you.
Yeah, but you do realize that like the if you know thing is all like an inside joke, right? It's not entirely an inside joke, but it's sort of like it's not like the thing that is the knowing is not something that's so vital that it's to the survival of the species. It's like if you know where the if you've been to calf, you know where the good chow hall is. If you know, you know. Because I don't want to tell everybody where the good chow hall
That's
is.
how it came about to be.
Oh,
But it's
okay.
completely used. That's how the whole if you know thing, it very much came about to be an inside joke for sure.
Okay.
But it's often used now on social media in a legitimate, like, if you don't know, you're not part of the club, and I'm not going to
Okay. Well,
bring you into the fold.
I'm going to come out as an elitist here and kind of be aggressive to gun culture. The only people who I've ever encountered who are participating in gatekeeping are the kind of people that wouldn't be invited into the clubs that they're supposed to be gatekeeping. So
Yeah.
have you ever been to SHOT Show?
Not yet.
Okay.
Hopefully,
So
trying to see if I can come next year.
if you 2025 or
4.
2024. Okay, well if you're there at 2024, we should link up. But
Absolutely.
point being said, and I think this is kind of the important part, is that the characters, because you talked about gatekeeping earlier on, and I want and I've had a challenge with this one, is like I've always wanted to say, show me the receipts. Like, where is the guy that's gatekeeping you, and why do you care about that person's opinion? And there's a danger, because a person can become so arrogant that they don't pay attention to anybody's advice. And a person doesn't have to be a Delta Army Ranger SEAL sniper Tim Kennedy action hero to have something valuable to present to the table, right? They don't, but we know this. Like, okay, the people who I experience and I observe who do this thing called gatekeeping are like mid-level management at best. They're sort of like,
Yeah.
okay, so you basically what's happened to them, and it's very oftentimes the case, is that they got into gun culture and they did something stupid. They did something like what I did. When I bought my first handgun, I literally bought it because of it. It was off of a video game. I was playing a Splinter Cell game. I saw the USP 45 and I thought it was the coolest gun ever. So I went out, and when I got my first handgun, I bought an H&K USP 45 compact. And that was the only handgun I had for a long time. And now, and eventually, I got more serious in the industry, especially after I got out of the military, and I sold that and I bought something else and I bought something else and I built up and I started learning all these bits and pieces. Because the military, I was a ranger, I was an Army Ranger, so I got to play a lot with big explosives and AR-15s or M4s or saws or Kalashnikovs or whatever you want to call it, right? But like handguns weren't our specialty, especially not in 2010, where for 2 deployments I didn't even carry it on my hip, because unless I was going to the chow hall. And so,
Which is always so funny to me how much people are like, oh, that guy, the number of times I've heard this, like, oh, well, that guy's like, ex-Army Ranger, ex-Special Forces, like he's got to know what he's talking about in the context of shooting a handgun. I'm like,
no,
not,
I don't. I didn't.
not necessarily.
Look, I didn't know how to shoot a handgun. I mean, I did. I wasn't terrible. We by the time I got out, we were doing like our own private competitions, and we were teaching each other how to shoot and stuff. And we were there's a term in Ranger Battalion called sua sponte, and that is sua sponte, do what you want. It's like of their own accord. It's this idea of like I don't need to be instructed. Comical. I need to dig into this in a whole nother episode, which is going to happen later. But there's this issue is that like CQB is an example. Like I did basic training, airborne school, Ranger selection, which was RIP at the time, and then got into Ranger Battalion. And like I've been doing CQB in all these different kind of little ways. And so like that didn't make me like a ninja master. It took time to build. But what I learned how to do in the military was not necessarily how to shoot a gun. I learned how to kill people. Let's not be stupid. And I don't mean in like, oh, use the flip trick with the arm elbow thing. I mean like establish pattern of life, identify key indicators, defense mechanisms, these kind of issues, which sounds like really rah cool, but I'm not going to try to talk it down. I didn't learn how to become an excellent marksman solely because of the military. I did become a designated marksman. I was a more proficient shot than many of my peers because I grew up with firearms in my hands, but it wasn't like, the oh, he's military trained. It's like, dude, I learned how to do a night raid. I learned how to do it. I learned how to do a CQB. I learned how to do a react to combat, a react to ambush, a react to contact, these kind of things. Like I learned how to do these things, and then I practiced them over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And so this going back to the gatekeeping approach is that even in my life, I bought a gun off of a video game concept, and I was like, oh, it's cool. And then I realized it wasn't cool. It was not the gun that I really wanted because it was not for what I wanted to do. Because after
What was it?
A USP 45 compact.
Of course.
Big 45, heavy, 8-round capacity. It's still, was it a good gun? I think so, but M45 was never cheap. And so I sold that and I bought a Smith & Wesson M&P9. And then I started learning more. And for a window, I was that guy. I was like, I learned this, and then I kind of did the like, well, not necessarily the gatekeeping thing. It was like, oh, well, you gotta know this. And then that had to get checked really quickly.
Yeah.
And my point in all of this is that like the gatekeeping conversation, the social media sort of if you know thing is almost always coming from either someone who's on their way through it and is going to get out of it really quickly, or somebody whose opinion you probably don't care about anyway. It's like there's a club.
Well, I do think I completely agree with you, and I do think there's a lot of perceived gatekeeping. So if we like take Christianity and the church as an example, a lot of people have this perception of, oh, if I'm going to go into like a church, and like a good church, a church, not some of the churches out there that are, come as you are, stay as you are, do whatever you want. Just come here and as one preacher that I used to listen to, singing Kumbaya around a campfire doesn't make you a church. But a lot of people have that concept of like, oh, I don't look this way. I do this, I do that. I can't come to church and people are going to judge me. People are going to think less of me. And there are churches that will do that for sure. But the reality of it is a lot of times those people will come and they'll feel super welcomed. Sure, maybe they look different. Maybe they feel weird about themselves, but they'll actually be like, oh, these people are really nice and they're not judging me and criticizing me and making me feel bad for the way that I look and for having tattoos or the way that I dress or everything else. Is like I don't feel that. So a lot of that gatekeeping I think is absolutely perceived. I've kind of experienced this myself where I perceived when I first decided I'm going to start getting into the industry that I had no military background. I had no law enforcement background. People aren't going to take me seriously. What do I have to do to make myself taken seriously? And I thought that I was going to be pushed back and that I needed to prove myself. And there is a measure of that for sure. But what I then realized very early on was people were like, oh, this guy, and this is what I've received directly from people telling me this. They're like, oh, you clearly really believe this stuff. You do your best to communicate it well. and you're actively pursuing getting better and growing. And that's great. And there's a bit of me that has always been surprised by when certain people have followed me that I've stopped and been like, oh, I knew that person. Really? They think I'm okay? And I was expecting some sort of like, oh, he's not serious. He's too fancy, or he's too this or too that. There's a lot of that like perceived gatekeeping that's not actually going on. That's our minds, lying to us to an extent. I do think there is. Go ahead.
Nope. I was just gonna say, I think some people call it imposter syndrome as well,
Yeah,
which is like
for sure.
I'm not the one who fits in this club.
Yeah. Moses is the ultimate, I feel like. It's like, no, don't use me. I'm bad at speaking. But I think there is the other measure of it where there are people, there's another element that, again, this still isn't gatekeeping, where people might be really critical. They might be gatekeepers that are really critical, but then they don't actually push someone out of the space. They don't actually do anything to gatekeep. And where I've seen this is I have seen a bunch of people, and I've had conversation with people that absolutely will tear into Lucas Botkins. And oh, I hate that guy, and oh this and oh that, and who does that guy think he is? But then they're like, they don't actually disagree with anything that he says. They buy his products. They aren't going to tell you, no, I wish that guy would stop doing what he's doing. They're like, oh, no, he can keep doing what he's doing. So they might not like it. They might push back against it, which I understand. And, it's like, if you're a guy who's been in the military for years and maybe you hit the gym like crazy and you're super buff and you think you're super tough and this and that, and then you see this scrawny homeschooling kid who looks like he played too much video games growing up, which is fairly accurate from what I can tell, running out and shooting, and that's like, oh man, he can shoot that gun way better than I can. That's going to piss you off to some extent. But whatever your motives are, that's another type of perceived gatekeeping that I see, where it's like they're not actually bouncing anyone out of the club, but they are just like, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. But then they don't do anything about it. So I'm just like, well, get over it, and who cares? I feel like there was more gatekeeping, and I'm not an expert and I'm new to this space. So my understanding of it has been, and what I've seen a little bit of, is there's a lot of like elitist gatekeeping, but it's not within the Second Amendment community, the gun industry that we're talking of. It's more within the sportsman firearm community where I've actually seen that. And those people are just not even part of the same club. They're gatekeeping an elitist ownership or something like that, but they're not even part of the two-way club, if you will.
Are you talking about the kind of person who buys a $250,000 pair of shotguns?
Yeah.
Yeah, those people are royalty. Like they're
Yeah.
aristocracy. They're not making podcasts like we're making podcasts.
Yeah.
They're not, I mean,
they're the people with like the NRA museums or contributing their collection to the NRA museum and stuff like that.
Sure. And I mean, and I don't mean to be even crass about it, but that is a world of its own. Like it is its own microculture. It's its own micro community. And that's just how it is. Like I've visited their locations. I've shot some shotguns with some folks, but it's not like, like I don't know. I'm not entitled.
It's a small enough percentage. Like why? Who cares?
Yeah, but I don't think they're. I don't know even where you would go with that, because it's like, yeah, I guess if you don't have a $300,000 pair of shotguns, then you're not really playing the game. Yeah, but I don't.
Okay.
I'm not in a financial position, nor is that like what I see as my end all be all in life is, but that's fine. Like, and I doubt they do either. So what? I think we need to take a pretty hard. I think we need to take a really hard pull off of gatekeeping, because I think we've beat this one to death. I think we've,
for sure.
Because but I really do appreciate your perspective, because the subject is one that continues to come back. It's perennial, but it's also one where I think that as we approach it with integrity, we start peeling back the layers of what these arguments are made and start seeing what the issues are. And one of the issues I think that we came to the discerning today was that if your actions are inconsistent with your words, particularly in the sense of if you claim to be holding this as a value, but your actions are sort of in betrayal on that, people are going to notice and they're going to say, hey, this ain't right. Some of those people will be sincere and some of those people will not. And
Yeah,
that's just, and
100%.
it takes discernment to figure out which is which.
Absolutely.
Let's go for a really hard segue here. And this is, earlier you started talking about your family, and you talked about your family as in you're a first generation. So your grandfather escaped and he was a cool guy with the CIA. I have a hunch on where that was involved. But your grandfather was a character who worked, who through a sense of movement, got himself out of him and his family out of Castro's reign. And then your father and mother lived here in America as a, that would be first generation, right?
Well, they were born
In
in Cuba,
okay,
so
yep. So
both
they
of
were
my
the
parents were born in Cuba. So I'm the first generation to be.
born
You
here.
could say
Yep.
I'm just second generation, but I'm the first generation to be born here. Is what I
Nope,
mean.
you're the first. We'll go with that. And so I think that's a good, just to make sure I'm clarifying on that one. And so you, was your grandfather considered a refugee?
Probably
Okay. Did
because
it,
America would have considered themselves to be open to Cuban refugees at that time.
because I'm really I've been thinking, we've been dealing with this lately in the world, and that is
Mhm.
irregular versus regular warfare, which is regular warfare is troops in uniforms and soldiers and rules of engagement. Irregular is insurgencies, to some extent guerrillas, but not as quite specific. And taking advantage of maybe things like economy, economic impact, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
The difficulty of irregular warfare is it can get so broad that it avoids definition as a whole, and we want to contain it as best as we possibly can. And claiming refugee status is a social and a political and an economic method of damaging a country, because then you get to fill them with your people who have your ideas, who vote for your things, and take their money. But it doesn't mean that everyone who's engaging in who is a refugee exists on that level. And
For
so
sure.
I wanted to hear what your family, like, what was it like? You talked about it a little bit. What is it like being a refugee, not a refugee? What is it like being in that kind of position of Cuban family escaping Castro? And let's start with, why did you say Castro was a brilliant leader?
Um, he was very effective in bringing about the regime that he wanted. He convinced the Cuban people, and I'm not an expert on like this history and stuff like that, but he did an excellent job of convincing the people that he was for them. He overthrew Bautista before him, who was an oppressive leader, and Castro was a revolutionary, and everyone loved him. I mean, this was the guy that like people were like, oh yeah, he's fighting for us. He's overthrowing the oppressors. And then he brilliantly maneuvered that into getting people behind him, getting people to follow him, and then oppress them even more than the person before him.
Okay, how did your parents and your grandparents talk about Castro?
They absolutely 100% hated him.
Can you give me an example of what that looked like or sounded like?
What do you mean?
Well, because like hating somebody isn't a very descriptive word. I mean,
They loved their country.
yeah.
I'll talk about my grandfather because my grandfather on my dad's side. So my grandparents on my mom's side came over on freedom flights, which were flights that basically Cuba was saying like, hey, if you don't want to be here and you want to leave, America was accepting refugees at that time, and so you could legally leave Cuba and come to the States. And Cuba was like, okay, fine, leave. So they came legally. My grandfather's on my dad's side. My dad's family came over illegally. Coming to the U.S. was legal for them. Leaving Cuba was illegal. So my grandparents on my mom's side were not passive, but they went about it in a slightly less aggressive way. And they came through the correct channels and, worked themselves into society, both worked into America, became citizens, voted, just became regular American citizens the best that they possibly could. They didn't want to make a scene. My grandfather on my dad's side came over and joined the military in the U.S. with the one his only purpose being to try to overthrow Castro. So he was actually on Castro. There's a publication, I cannot find it anywhere. My grandfather showed me like a sliver of it that he has kept, but I can't find the actual publication. But Castro actually released a like most wanted list. And he would rate them on 1 to 5, giving like 1 to 5 stars based off of how dangerous they were. And my grandfather was a 5. So he was actually on Castro's most wanted list for a period of time.
So is this a conspiracy that your grandfather wasn't a humble lighthouse maintenance guy, but rather somebody of much greater importance?
I don't think so, truthfully.
I mean,
maybe.
Because I read the story, and I would recommend people heading over to your website and giving that a read. But I read your story on the bio section, and I was like, oh wow, you know.
So everything I'm saying you've read already.
I still like to hear it again because it's coming from you.
Yeah, but I'm always careful because I've verified whatever I can, and what I'll tell people is, because it's a grandfather telling stories, right? And then it's getting translated. I don't speak Spanish, so it's getting translated because he doesn't really speak English. But the stories have not changed since I heard them when I was 5 to now that I'm in my 30s. And every single piece of information that I have been able to verify has been exact down to like the numbers that he's used. So he'll like tell me a story and like use specific numbers and dates. And when I can find any verification of it, it's exact. So that's led me to trust his information a little bit more. His hatred of Castro was expressed in that he viewed him as a man who took over his country, and he very much loved his country. My grandfather, again, he wanted to overthrow Castro to return to the U.S. When the U.S. government dropped,
he wanted
to return to Cuba.
Okay.
When the U.S. government dropped the program that he was on, I think Carter dropped the program that he was a part of that was trying to lead to the liberation of Cuba. He basically like was just absolutely devastated because his whole life purpose was to get his family back to Cuba. And so he hated Castro very specifically for what he did to his home country, the threat that he raised. His father was also in the military in Cuba, and his father also fled the country and is actually the one who told him. So my dad's family came over in 1962, which was only 2 years after Castro's takeover. And my mom's family didn't come until 1966 or 1967, which is when most people were kind of starting to come. 1962 is pretty early for people to flee. It's because my grandfather's father, my great-grandfather, was also in the military and was like, hey, this man's bad. He's dangerous. He's going to destroy our country, and he's going to come after anyone who resists him, so get out. My grandparents on my mom's side, like I said, they were a little bit more passive. They weren't as like vehement when they would talk about him, but they basically were just like, they were so radically against the communist ideology and the socialist ideology, and they viewed it as having completely uprooted and destroyed their lives. And they viewed America as being this wonderful place where they could come and they could do whatever they want, and they could have whatever success and whatever riches and whatever comforts that they wanted if they simply worked hard enough for it. Whereas in Cuba, my mom's family was scheduled to be on a freedom flight that would have left Cuba, and then that flight got canceled, and they weren't able to get on one for another year. For that year that they lived in Cuba after that, they were branded enemies of the state, and all of their belongings were confiscated. They were allowed to remain in their house, but they weren't allowed to actually like make any transactions. So they had to live like they had no furniture. They had so they slept on the floors, ate on the floor for a year. They were given very, very limited rations. So their life was just, brutal. They'd have, things painted on their doors. They'd have food thrown at them. But people were like, oh, you're causing us problems. We saw similar things, honestly, with people ratting out their neighbors during COVID, like, oh, this person isn't adhering to the restrictions. So that sort of thing they experienced very severely for a year. And my uncle, my mom's brother, was months away from turning the age that he would have been taken off to essentially an indoctrination camp where he'd be trained by Castro to be one of his troops. And so when they left, they just barely were able to leave with him. And so there was just a level of fear from them, not necessarily hatred, but just a level of fear and resentment, if anything else. I don't remember specifically what they said. I just remember like how all of that was communicated and how my parents then communicated that to me. That was like, look, our parents risked their lives to an extent to enable us to then give you all of the things that you now have and experience in the US.
I think so. I'm afraid that the subject can be a little overblown or overused, and I do kind of want to be careful about that. But I'm rather impressed at the immediacy of your story being, or your family story, right? Because you've got multiple elements. You have a charismatic leader who comes in promising freedom from a dictator or a tyrannical government who only returns around and makes his worse. And then you've got a family that escapes and has to undergo difficulty, and then they bring values that they don't even really bring the values alone. It's that they reinforce the values that they see, that they believe represented in America. And so I think there's a kind of a question that I wanted to be able to ask you, but I don't know if I have it anymore. I feel like you've already started nailing it out.
There was a very much an extent that they brought those values with them. This is, I can't put data out for this, but that generation of Cubans that came into Miami specifically started to transform Miami into being a very famous and well thought of city that it is today. And most people who have experienced working with, most of them are, blue collar workers because they didn't have an education. My grandfather was a blue collar worker because he had a third grade education. My on my dad's side, on my mom's side, I think he probably had a first grade education. But so they came to the US, they got whatever jobs they could, and tons of those relatives of mine, those distant aunts and uncles, are actually like millionaires living in Miami, super super well. And they literally came over here, and one of my great uncles borrowed a lawnmower from a next door neighbor to start mowing lawns, and then soon he was able to buy his own lawnmower, and now he owns a like a greenery and nursery down there that's extremely successful, and he has like 4 houses in Miami. And it literally started with borrowing a lawnmower. I think they brought a lot of their work ethic with them. The Cuban people are very industrious, and that's part of what's been kind of sad to see, that they've been oppressed for so long. But when they did come over, either they came over with enough gratitude for what they had in America that then led to them being industrious, or they brought some of that in industry with them, and that led to them being successful. But that's a little bit common knowledge. If you go to South Florida, if you go anywhere in Florida, that's a little bit common knowledge of like, okay, that generation of Cubans could outwork just about anyone else that you'll ever see.
Yeah, I've been there and I've seen it. It has its own testimony. I want to. I think one thing that I think that some of us who were born in America and have these kind of questions are not envious but admirable about is the conviction. The conviction, as you said, your uncle was so convicted in a sense with his belief in working and doing well and industriousness and providing for his family, that responsibility of sorts, that he turned a lawn mowing business into eventually growing his position to where he's at now. And I don't I'm thinking about it in a couple ways where I think sometimes it gets lost when we attribute a certain trait to a certain people's, like it's exclusive to being Cuban, but that as if industriousness is exclusive to being Cuban. But rather it's something that we admire in that this generation came over from Cuba and escaped what was essentially an anti-culture, this sort of communist socialist purge of virtue and value, and they escaped something like that and brought with them to America this conviction to follow through with their values.
Yeah.
And that is something that we should take encouragement from. I don't want to like wax too poetic around it. Just I think that's the part that I get out of it. It's not that they're industrious alone or that they are hardworking or they had something else. Just like, no, I can do this. I will go do it, and they commit themselves. They commit that generation committed itself to hard work.
Yeah, 100%. And I think different cultures have put different emphasis on certain values, and you see that throughout the world. One thing that I've experienced when I travel a lot for work is like Italy puts such a strong emphasis on hospitality that I feel at home there. Every time I go there, you go to a restaurant, they want to make you feel like you're at home.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there are other countries that are wonderful and have a lot of other great things about them that I just do not feel that way. Dubai, for example, I definitely didn't feel the strong sense of hospitality, but they just have this incredible sense of caring about engineering and design and aesthetics that they've built the most unified and perfect looking city on the planet. Um, Truly, because it was designed all together, which like, you drive through New York, and I like New York, but you drive through New York and it's clearly like, oh, let's put a building here and there's a little gap right there, let's put a building there, and well, we need to make it bigger, so let's just go up because there's no extra room, whereas Dubai is like perfectly mapped out and planned. And different cultures put a different emphasis on different values. In America, we value individualism.
Mm-hmm.
Right, we value that opportunity, which we've lost a lot of what those traditional American values are. Those are extremely under attack, but it used to be that the individual in America, you could be the underdog. I mean, America was the underdog, and this is why I think, like, Rocky the movie is such a great example of American ideals, because it's like, it's this underdog individual who's able to step up, gets an opportunity, and then just kills it at that opportunity. So every culture has its own values that they emphasize. And I think I'm extremely patriotic and love identity in our countries. And I take a lot of identity in being both an American and a Cuban. But I very much think we just need to observe other countries. And if they have, and other cultures, not just countries, but other cultures. And if there are other things that cultures, other qualities that cultures have that can benefit us, we need to lean into those. There's certainly a lot of qualities in the Cuban culture from my grandfather, that I have taken so much inspiration from, that I do not copy. And if I did copy, my wife would probably leave me, because he did amazing things for his country, or tried to, and he was extremely brave and saved his family, and then basically, not being too harsh, but spent much more time going off and trying to save his country, and a lot less time actually staying at home and taking part in his family's life. So like, his values were very much misaligned there, and that culture was very strongly like, oh, if I provide, I've done my job. Whereas I would say, like, no, providing is kind of like just one little part of your responsibility towards your family.
Yeah, it's just
But that's a different topic.
no, and it's a good one. It's I think though in our generation. So I'm in my 30s, and in my generation, in our generation, probably best to say it that way. The idea that of a delinquent husband is sort of strange. Like, it's not common in our generation, where we grew up with TV shows and movies and stories and warnings at church where, like, just because you make money doesn't mean that you're sufficient as a father.
Right.
And I think our generation has its own set of problems, but that's not the biggest one on the table. Now, for some people, it certainly is.
Yeah.
If you wake up, you work all day. You wake up, you go to work, you come home, you play video games, you kiss your wife to good night, and you go to bed.
Yeah. We've flipped a little bit. It is interesting. This is a topic that I'd love to discuss if we had time, but it is interesting to me how, even not culturally, but generationally, the values will switch, where it's like, yeah, that last generation of men, our fathers and our grandfathers, they were tough. They did not communicate their emotions, which isn't necessarily being tough, but they thought it was.
Mm-hmm.
They wouldn't necessarily communicate their emotions. They absolutely worked harder than just about anyone nowadays can possibly work, and had no problem doing it. But then they were very, again, unemotionally attached, and would not emotionally present. They weren't able to truly love on and be supportive. And this whole idea of, like, good communication habits between spouses was just like, no, that wasn't necessarily a thing. It was in some cases, but widespread. You just didn't see men seeking as actively to empathetic. Nowadays, you do see a lot of men being much more emotionally in tune, able to sit down and have a, I hate the phrase to be honest, but emotionally intelligent conversation with a woman, being able to be a little bit more understanding. But a lot of those same guys are kind of weak and lazy, and I say lazy not to say like, oh, they'd sit around doing nothing, but their work capacity is just like pretty minimal.
They're emotionally sensitive but emotionally weak, and I'll be
Yeah.
very clear on that one. Is that like, yeah, you can understand what you're empathetic, you've got great empathy, you have no spine, you have no emotional conviction, and that
Which
is
I, yeah, which, and that's kind of our culture nowadays. And it's really interesting because I'll see men doing things and I'm like, I kind of wish like that last generation of men had a little bit more of that. But then at the same time, to quote John Wayne in McClintock, I think was the movie, where he said his wife, or a estranged wife, I can't remember which, but anyway, someone who was close to him referred to a man as a gentleman. I was like, well, at least he's a gentleman. And he said, to be a gentleman, you have to first be a man. So he fails on both counts. And I absolutely love that. And I 100% believe in that. I think that all of these so-called men who are like, oh, I'm nice, I'm emotionally intelligent, I'm understanding, I can be empathetic. It's like, do you actually have any moral fortitude to be good and act in a good manner on that empathy? If you don't, then no, you're not a man.
you just opened up a huge can of worms, and we will. Oh, you just opened up a huge can of worms. So, you remember when like that kind of nice guy epidemic started coming about, where like you had no more
Oh yeah,
Mr. You started seeing things like no more Mr. Nice Guy,
I
um,
hate the nice guy thing.
or the
Absolutely
confession
despise it.
like or confessions of a nice guy. So like every sociopathic genocidal maniac I've ever met was a nice guy.
Oh yeah,
And I don't mean this in like I don't mean this in like a gentle, not every single one, but that's a bit hyperbole. But the point that I'm saying is like there's a reason the whole nice guy thing is has always been beat to death, and it's this idea that like, oh, I couldn't do anything wrong, I could never do anything violent because I'm not a violent person, I don't know how to do that, I don't go to the gym because I don't want to be so strong that I hurt somebody, and I don't want to go to the I don't want to learn how to fight because I don't want to accidentally like let my rage get out of control, and I don't want to learn I don't want to own a gun because it's like, okay, I guarantee you, not guarantee you, that's gonna be too hard, that is the person who goes onto Twitter and advocates for the genocide of a population because their fifis got hurt. There's a direct correlation between people who have deliberately hamstrung their capability of understanding violence and culture to immediately swinging to violent overthrow, and
yeah, 100%.
that is a one for one. Like, I'm not saying that every single person who exists within that category who isn't as masculine as Joe Rogan is a genocidal maniac, but the whole nice guy thing is like there's a bit of a pathology going on here.
There's a line from How I Met Your Mother where Ted and if you haven't watched the show, three of the main characters who are guys get into a fight with like the bartender. Someone challenges them, and the bartender, who's like the super macho guy, is like, I'm gonna, like, you guys are regulars here, we're gonna go out and we're gonna fight these guys. They go out and they get into a fight with the guys, and then one of the girls, who's the main character later, is like, what are you doing? You're a nice guy, you don't go out into fights, you don't hit people. And I just like, I want to throw up. It's like, he's not a nice guy. Like, if you look at the guy's character, I mean, he has like 30 girlfriends throughout the whole show that he's constantly bouncing from one woman to another. He's cheated on quite a few of them. He's like broken the hearts of many of them. It's just like, how is this a nice guy? Well, because he's emotionally intelligent. He's empathetic. He likes to be nice, but he
Is
doesn't
this
have
like
that moral.
the Ted character, like the main character?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I haven't seen this season. I haven't seen the series much. I mean, I've caught episodes of it, but it's kind of like what's the other one?
It's a spoof on Friends, 100%.
Sure. I mean, it's a sitcom. Okay.
Yeah.
But
that's a concept so Jordan Peterson talks about this, and I think he talks about it better than just about anyone else, where he was like, no, to be good, you have to be a monster. It takes incredible strength to be good. And rather than thinking, oh, I need to be nice, I need to be kind, it's like, well, yes, you do need to be nice and kind to people. But that's going to take strength. That's going to take a huge amount of moral capacity to do that. And so men need to actually, men particularly, again, I think everyone, but specifically men, need to have that capability for strength, for being dangerous, for being a monster, for being capable of great evil. Not great evil, great violence. And then they need to learn how to control it. And that's where actually being good is.
Yeah, there's this another casual abuse of the Bible is this idea of like turning the other cheek. And it's this
Yeah.
right, and the problem that I have with the way that it's not even that I have, it's not an original criticism, people have heard this before.
Yeah.
If you don't have a choice, if you're just if you don't have a choice, you're not actually turning the other cheek.
Yeah.
Right, so like if you do not have an alternative, if you have made yourself into such that even at the curl of a fist you bend over backwards and give up the faith because you're afraid of a little bit of conflict, then there's no turning of the other cheek for you.
Yeah.
You're not turning it, you're just folding.
Yeah. I think the concept of there's a lot of people who are extremely evil that would be murderers and thieves and, homicidal maniacs, that the only thing that keeps them from being those things is they're too scared to do that. And so their cowardice keeps their evil in check. And it's like, when you think about that, that's kind of crazy because people would usually look at those people and be like, oh, he's a nice guy. And it's like, he probably is capable of actually, there a lot of people who are capable of literally murdering, being serial killers.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing keeping them in check from doing that is the fact that they're just too afraid to.
Yeah, you hear this amongst veterans often. It's like, oh, he went overseas, or I went overseas and then I saw evil. Dude, when you come home, you see it.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, so I remember looking into the eyes of a young man. There's nothing left of him but hatred. There was nothing left of him. He had given his entire soul over to hatred, and it was a tragedy, but it was there. It's just there's nothing left of him. He's a withered husk. And then I came home to America and I saw the exact same thing, and it was like, oh,
Yep.
no, that person, because people will do this weird thing with each other. They'll give this weird kind of grace of like, oh, he doesn't have bad intentions, he's just ill-informed. At some point in time, your ill information has to be maintained, and that's when ignorance becomes malice.
Yeah.
That's when you have
we have the responsibility for our own knowledge. If we're
Mhm.
ill-informed, it's your fault.
At some point in time, yep. So, well, we could either get into one more subject or we can call it for a day. How are you feeling for time?
I personally love this particular subject. Did you want to dive into this more or talk about one more thing?
Are you talking about goodness and evil?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's do it because this is I wanted to talk to you about filmmaking, but I think this is a little bit more important.
I just wanted to at least say this. So this, for me, ties everything in because I talk about, and I love to talk about like masculinity and traditional masculinity, because talking about gun culture and guns themselves, I believe guns, to me, a gun is a tool that enables me to be a stronger, more capable man. I believe in gun ownership because I believe that men need to be capable of violence. And you can't truly be a capable and violent and dangerous man without knowing how to use a gun to some extent. Now, there's exceptions to that. There are men like, again, I'm just going to keep using the same person, Jordan Peterson, who is so mentally capable that he is waging a much greater war on the cultures that he's against with his mind and with his words than he ever could with actual violence. But I think for most people, and myself included, being physically strong and physically capable is part of me actually being a good man. And so all of these things that we're discussing now, to me, is actually the first step that leads me into the importance of gun ownership. When I talked about responsibility, masculinity and the responsibilities of a man, to me, precedes gun ownership, because guns are just the tools that I then can use to act on those things that are my responsibilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was writing this down as you were talking about it. The military adage, mission dictates gear. But we're not talking about missions right now. We're talking about values. So
Yep.
what happens if you replace the word mission with values? Values dictates gear. And gear also implies being able to use them, so then there's skills. And so when you're looking at what your values are, self-defense is not a value, it's sort of an offshoot of value, just like safety isn't itself really a value, it's sort of a conglomerate or an ancillary component. Values might be a value is that I uphold my responsibility to my family, my community, my culture maybe. And that means that value dictates what I should be moving towards, whether it's gainful work, meaningful speech, capabilities of violence, especially in this one, is that we're talking about. And I would agree with you. So you've got a two-pronged, you've already built a two-pronged approach. There is the one hand where if you're not capable of it, you can't claim credit for not doing it. And then the other one you're doing values dictate skills.
Yep.
And skills imply gear. There you go.
100%.
Yeah.
No, but you just framed that up perfectly. I don't really have anything to add to that, to be honest.
Oh, damn! Sorry. It's a subject that I've been writing on for a while now, and not writing, but it's been a very meaningful subject, and so I think,
to me, it's important because that whole concept of being dangerous, of being capable of violence, and this is an offshoot topic, so I'll just address it but not go into it. Whether or not violence is amoral is, I think, a very important thing for people to understand. I believe violence is amoral. What do I mean by that? It's kind of trying to think of a good example. The violence itself isn't what's good or bad. It's how it's done, by whom it's done, and why it's done. So if violence were evil, then God would be someone who does evil and tells people to do evil. We know that can't be true. And I'm not even going to bother arguing for whether violence is good or bad outside of a biblical context, because to me, there is no definition of violence outside of the Bible, so that's absolutely pointless. But God specifically commands people to commit acts of violence, even if it's in the sense of, in the New Testament, saying that the government is supposed to be the sword of justice, which would mean committing violence against individuals who have broken the law. And then God himself also obviously commits acts of violence by killing people himself and being violent towards them. So violence can't be wrong because God is very violent. Therefore, when we commit violence, it's only wrong if we do it against the innocent, if we do it in a self-assertion, if we do it, there's a bunch of different tiers that we can put on that, but violence itself is not wrong. Being capable and skilled in violence then means that we are now equipped to resist those people who would do violence wrongly. And the only way to oppose wrong violence is with good violence. And I'm phrasing it as basically as I feel like I possibly can. That, I believe, if you consider yourself to be a good person, I hate that phrase. If you are attempting to be a good moral person, you have to, in some capabilities, be capable of resisting bad violence. And you're not going to do that with words. You're not going to be able to do that in any other capacity. And this is where I love, no one addresses this issue more than John Lovell with Warrior Poet Society. Where it's like, when bad men want to do bad things to good people, good men doing bad things to bad men is the only thing that's going to stop it, essentially.
Which is, I mean, if you want to get nitpicky, he just said bad things twice. Like, oh, good men doing bad things to bad. It is a good thing to uphold justice.
It is, yeah.
You know what I mean? It's kind of funny, but like, it's a play on words, and John Lovell's an inspiration for sure. John Lovell's achieved. He's done a great thing with his Warrior Poet Society, but I won't talk about people in this sense. So I think you're on to you're taking a series of arguments that are near and dear to my heart. and one of them being, let's start with defining the moral framework of violence itself. And it's like, if you have a Christian worldview, you cannot rightly state that violence itself is either a necessary evil or necessarily evil. Now, I mean necessarily in a modal sense, which would be in
Right.
all possible worlds, violence is always evil, because God not only does what we consider violence, but he also commands people to do it. Now, in
And
a
I've heard people make the argument that God does that in response to man's violence after evil entered the world, but then now you're implying that God changed once evil entered the
yeah,
world, and that's
it's a youth it's a
very problematic.
yeah, it's just called the Euthyphro dilemma. That if you don't, that's the solution to that one. Does God love that which is good, or is it good because he loves it? It's good because he loves it. Because if God loves that which is good because it's good outside of his power, then something has authority over him. Then
Yep.
functionally he's not God, and therefore your hierarchy of values is off place. Speed run out of that. The next one then is the amorality of violence itself. Excellent way of phrasing it. I think you're right on the money there. Where I think I think we're going forward with this is um, its application, and how do we discern that, and how do we study that, and how do we learn that? Because on the one hand, you've presented this sort of worldview that goes, well, part of being good is being able to do good violence against people who do bad violence. Fair. I think another part of it too is being skilled in the capability of violence is also itself a, not a stopgap, but it's a being skilled in it. To become skilled in violence, you must be controlled. You must be
Yeah.
contained. And so by even becoming skilled in it, you are learning to contain it, which implies a moral framework, and whether or not you are participating in that moral framework doesn't it are will have an effect on you.
Everyone everyone is capable of violence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Everyone is capable at attempting violence. There's a
Mm-hmm.
human being who the whole concept of like, oh, I would never hurt a fly. Give me a break. Maybe there's a couple people, but I'm just going to say everyone. Um, Everyone is capable of attempting violence. Not everyone is capable of actually committing violence. There's a lot of people who potentially, maybe they're not even cowards, maybe they would act on it, but they just don't know how. Maybe they are actually incapable of it. The only way for you to become disciplined enough to not act on violence in a self-serving way is for you to be skilled and trained in violence and then learn to discipline it, exactly as you said.
Yeah. So
So if we want to, as men, be able to keep our violence in check, we have to actually train it and
yes,
train the discipline of it.
exactly. We are right
That's
on
what I think that's where you were going with that. And I was like, I want
you
to say it.
you nailed it. So everyone is capable of attempting violence. If Stephen Hawking had dedicated his life to learning how to use his brain box to hack things, then he could have theoretically hacked a dam, causing it to self-destruct, killing a family of 5,000 or whatever.
Yeah.
Through its like, it's not this. It's not so. Let's not be so crass and simple-minded that all forms of violence are like action hero violence.
Right.
You got to be a little careful on how far you stray it, though. Last component of this subject, though, would be, so everyone is capable of committing violence. It is the act of becoming skilled in it, which is part of learning to control it. The only part of evidence that I have, or one piece of evidence that still reminds me and encourages me to this day, is the issue of school shootings.
Mm-hmm.
No one who's gone on to try to commit an atrocity or an action of that type, a school mass murder, however language you want to, was actually in any way, shape, or form good at what they were doing. And for this, we are very thankful for it. In fact,
Yeah.
all the
And
people
that's a
who are,
very easy point to argue in the numbers themselves because of how many rounds were fired compared to how many injuries there were compared to how many deaths there were. If those people were skilled in it, the death number compared to the injury number would be way higher.
Mhm. But what we find is that the people who are actually skilled in capability of violence are either willingly abstaining or gainfully employed. So
Yeah. Yep.
cool.
100%. 100%. And that's something that people talk about, like Jocko Willink puts forth And the little bit of MMA training that I've done, my instructor, who is a very, very strong believer, put forth as well, is like, by learning how to do these things, we're going to be that much more vigilant to not doing these things. Whereas like if you teach, not only does teaching kids jujitsu, to use Jocko's example, help kids fight against bullies, but actually teaching bullies jujitsu makes those bullies significantly less likely to bully, because they no longer have that insecurity that they're trying to assert all the time. They now actually understand what they're capable of. That gives them confidence, and then also understanding their capability, like, oh, I'm not going to do that. And they also then, there's so many layers to it, they also then get exposed to, like if you do jujitsu, you get exposed to people who could very literally kill you in a couple of seconds. They would know how to snap your neck, and if you're rolling with someone, you've experienced what that feels like when you're like, oh shoot, they could kill me right now if they wanted to. And then they don't. And so you understand that whole power and control dynamic, and that changes the way that you go out and act. So there's 100%.
It certainly does. Yeah. I thought it was interesting. I haven't heard Jocko. I haven't listened to Jocko for a little while, but him bringing up bullies.
Yeah.
I am slowly being convinced that the obsession and terror with bullies that has defined so much of our history, my age history, is simply an excuse, an attempt to explain the world in a narrative of oppressor and oppressed, for the purpose of establishing the haves and have-nots, so that you can produce a revolution of the nerds, as it says, for the sake of, as you see where I'm going here, for the sake of not actually establishing any moral framework by which people should engage with one another, but a cycle of perpetual revolution of the downtrodden and the underdog.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I'm a conspiracy theorist now. Don't at me. So
we all are. We all are.
All in our heart. Okay.
It's not a theorist if they're true.
Ooh. Well, I don't know about that.
Maybe it is. Maybe
is
it
that
is. But I think all of these, I think this concept of violence, though, is extremely important for men, to people, I say men, people in general, to think through. These aren't just us sitting here and having lofty conversations about the morality of violence. I do think it's important for people to actually think through, if you're someone who owns, especially, and carries a gun on you, because you need to kind of understand the morality of what you could potentially have to do beforehand. And I think that if I would suggest, I have no framework to make any assertions in this, you potentially would have a lot more framework, having served in the military. I would suggest that a great amount of the PTSD that happens is men going in and committing certain acts that they had no moral framework for beforehand. Even if they then commit an act that they have a moral framework that tells them that's wrong, they did something wrong that perhaps they can now deal with and think through. But because they didn't even know what to do with it, that's where they then go into those that perpetuating cycle and just keep getting lower and lower and lower and lower.
I've been studying and writing about PTSD for the better part of 10 years, and you're onto something there. We're not going to be able to get into it today.
No,
we just should.
Not.
You've got a family to take care of. We got this podcast to go on. So, Peter, where do people find you, and how do they get a hold of you? Because I think we didn't even get into the most recent comedy drama of things that have been going on, although that's not really the intent of the show here.
But it's been funny.
It's, you know what, I'm really glad that you got some recognition, because I've known about your work for a little while. So
I appreciate that. So you can find me. My name is Peter Ildefonsa. That's ILDEFONSA. Ildefonsa. And if you find me on Instagram, it's just Peter Ildefonsa on Instagram. On YouTube as well, Peter Ildefonsa. Fortunately, that name's not taken anywhere. And then my website, which has a little bit of a bio talking about more of my family history that I went into somewhat today, giving it in a much more succinct manner, is peterildefonsa.com. And Twitter as well, pretty much all social media platforms. But if you can, subscribing to YouTube, following me on Instagram, checking out my website. I also have a newsletter called the Old Fashioned Newsletter, that I created basically to talk through some of these more philosophical things related to gun ownership that I feel like don't get addressed enough. And it also, my intention with it was also to give myself a little bit more of a platform to train articulation and learning how to communicate some of these topics, which I think is something that's very important for all gun owners to be able to do, is actually communicate their beliefs, to expand that community, and then also to be able to defend verbally, because verbal defense will always precede physical defense. I think we need to train both.
Well, yeah, in 99% of the cases, and then the one time where physical precedes verbal, you're dealing with a real enemy. You're dealing with somebody who's not interested in defeating you in the classic sense. So they're just destructive or special operations. Woo, no knocks. So let's do this. So Peter, it's been great having you on the show. I'd love to have you on again sometime. I think we today was just scratching the surface on, in some sense, you and I establishing some rapport, but also I think what you've done here it is built I can see what looks like a really good foundation. Like you're building into this idea, you're part of it. I get to say that only because I've been kind of part of gun culture for 15 years, but I really do. I really am glad that you're here with the community and you're here part of.
I appreciate that.
This expanse. So hope the best for you, and we'll talk to you soon. So
thank you so much, dude.
Yeah, let's kind of closing out for those who are still watching on the internet. If you are on, what is it? The actual Justice Warriors internet.com. If you're listening or you're on social media, we appreciate your comments, likes, and anything that allows the algorithm to push us a little bit forward. But as we both know, in gun culture, the best thing and the best way that we get out and our word gets out is you share this content with somebody else. So if this conversation was edifying for you, or it's a conversation that you want to have with one of your friends, please go ahead and share it so that we can continue to grow as we expand onwards. If you want to support the show for us, you can head over to redactedllc.com, and there is a shop there for some of the more boutique items that we create, or your classic patches, stickers, and so forth. And then we'll stay tuned. So Peter, let's have another conversation, and you go be a father first. We'll talk to you soon.
100%. Appreciate it, dude. Take care.
All right. God bless.
I think the girls with their nails done now.